Ladies and gentlemen, good afternoon. Welcome to DMZ Forum 2020, Session 1.2, titled DMZ as a World Heritage. My name is Song-Yi Choi. I will be serving as your MC in this session. As the international community is striving to overcome the COVID-19 crisis, I believe it is time for North Korea and the Republic of Korea to join hands together to overcome this crisis more than with any other country in the world. In this session, titled DMZ as a World Heritage, we hope to have an in-depth discussion on this topic with experts. Now we would like to officially begin session 1.2, DMZ as a World Heritage. I would like to introduce the speakers. First, we have Professor Tae-hoon Moon, professor of Chungang University, who is also serving as the president of the Korea Environment Policy and Administration Society. The first speaker is Mr. Bernhard Zelliger, representative of Han-Seidel Foundation Korea. And we also have Mr. Hyun-gyun No, Cultural Heritage Team Manager at Gyeonggi Institute of Cultural Properties. We have two discussants. First, we have Mr. Soo-jae Lee, Chief Research Fellow at Korea Environment Institute. Next, we have Ms. Eun-jin Park, Director of the National Institute of Ecology. Now, I would like to hand over the microphone to Professor Tae-hoon Moon, who is the moderator of this session. Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen.
시작하도록 하겠습니다. 오늘 소중한 발제분 두 분과 토론 두 분을 모셨습니다. 제한 시간이 있기 때문에 시간을 엄수해 주시기를 부탁을 드리겠고, 발표 시간은 각 연사당 20분씩이고 토론 시간은 각 토론자당 10분씩입니다. 시간
20 minutes for each presentation, and I will give 10 minutes for discussion. And we have a timer in front of this table, so please use the timer as you wish. Now we would like to move on to our first presentation. As the speakers were already introduced, I would like to jump into the first presentation, which is by Mr. Bernhard Zelliger, representative of Han-Seidel Foundation Korea. Mr. Zelliger, please.
Thank you very much, Mr. Moderator, and welcome everybody, and thanks for inviting me here to be at this very important conference. And I hope I can do what I was asked to do, namely to discuss the DMZ World Cultural Heritage or World Heritage designation on the background of the German experience. And I realized while I researched that topic that it's quite a task to do, but I hope we can achieve something here together. And what I want to discuss is, first of all, very shortly think about who protects what, how and why, because there are really many different aspects of that. There's aspects of environment, aspects of culture, of North and South Korea, etc. And shortly also look into the need for cooperation of North Korea. It's very easy to say and nice to hear all the time in Korea that it is said in South Korea, we need to have cooperation to overcome Corona. We need to have cooperation to overcome flooding and food crisis, etc. But only the desire from the South Korean side, unfortunately, doesn't make it happen. We have North Korea as a necessary partner for that, and that is difficult. And then I want to go over to the German experience of cultural exchange in international organizations like UNESCO, which would be necessary for World Heritage designation, and discuss a little bit the way forward. Now, first of all, it's not so clear what we want to protect and how we want to protect it. There are quite a few different ways area like the DMZ can be protected. And when we talk about the DMZ in everyday language, very often we do not actually distinguish between the DMZ proper, the CZZ, the DMZ on the South Korean side, the DMZ on the North Korean side. And when I go to do our when I go to do our bird surveys, for example, I always say I go to the DMZ, but in reality, I almost never have been inside the DMZ. It's just a manner of speaking. So we have to be very clear what we want to protect there. And as you know, we have already a number of protected areas in Korea and protection related to the DMZ. Namely, we have it as a UNESCO Biosphere Reserve now. That's very new, and probably most of you will remember that it was first of all rejected when the first attempt was made to designate it. We have it as a UNESCO Geopark now. We have certain areas which are specifically protected. And now the question is, what do we want to do? If you look at, for example, the different websites of the National Tourism Organization, of Gangwon Province, of Gyeonggi Province, we see DMZ tourism very often as one of the important features. But we look at different things. We look at culture, we look at environment, at history, at peace, and not all of the designations might work well with each other. I personally, our foundation works a lot in the field of environment, and we have a lot of problems when we have DMZ tourism and huge parking lots are built, or there's a restoration of a train plant through very, very sensitive ecological areas. We have this oldest this oldest protected zone in Korea, the so-called migratory pit stop in Cholon at the DMZ, which by now became unrecognizable because new roads have been built, new forms of small agro-industries have been built there. So it's really an important thing that we have to make clear what we want to do there. And there has been a drive for tourism, protection and designation in Korea and worldwide, and it's decades old now. I mean, we have the DMZ Forum, which was founded almost 20 years ago. We had Ted Turner coming in and offering a lot of money for that, etc. But until now, it was not very successful, unfortunately. And the motivations might be very diverse and often contradictory. You see here cranes flying over these hothouses near the DMZ, and if you go to the DMZ on the Gyeonggi side in Yeoncheon or so, you have massive problems with hothouses, ginseng production, all of which do not go well with protection of birds. And it's a sad fact, but especially when we don't look at the DMZ proper, but at the adjacent sites where more development is possible, we see that there's a massive development pressure already. Certainly, there's also the idea of cultural exchange of North and South Korea, though we have to say, until now it was not very successful. We had, I think, once or twice in all the history, 30 or 40 years history we have now of North-South meetings, with really meetings where actors or where musicians came together. We had the joint excavations in Kaesong, but all of this did not touch the DMZ proper. And we have to see that if you look at cultural exchange of North and South, it became so difficult because it was part of the systemic conflict, so culture could not really escape from that. Though both Koreas always say we share the same cultural heritage, culture was seen as part of the heritage seen through the South Korean lens or the North Korean lens. And therefore only cultural exchange could happen in conjunction with politics, and it was short-lived, for example, in the time of Sunshine Policy or in 2018, but there was no sustainable formula for cultural exchange beyond that, for cultural exchange which can exclude politics. And we'll see later that it was a little different in Germany, and that was a good thing, I think, because if we want to have a joint designation like in the UNESCO, we need to have precedences of cultural exchange. And then Also, we have to see that the view of the DMZ seems to be quite irreconcilable. I'm really amazed, living long time in Korea, how optimistic the South Koreans are on always saying the DMZ is a place where we can well work together. From the North Korean point of view, and I've visited the DMZ also from the North Korean side quite a few times, it is rather seen as that place where cooperation definitely cannot take part. The whole area being an area which is governed by the military, where also normal or activities which are allowed in the rest of North Korea, let's say cooperation activities, cannot take place. Again, in the field where we work in, which is nature protection and surveys of birds, it's all, and our partner, and afforestation, and our partner for that is the Ministry of Environment of DPRK. We can go almost everywhere beside the border area. The border area with one exception, and that's Kumgangsan. You can go, in Kaesong you could go in former times, but beside there's no cooperation willingness in the north regarding the border area, and there's a reason for that, because it's a militarily governed area. And you see here two explosions. One is a good explosion, namely the explosion of one of these former watchtowers in 2018, and then, as you know, the explosion last year of the Kaesong Cooperation Building. So we had only a very, very short time span in between where some form of cooperation seemed possible, and it's sad to see, but we have to see really, the DMZ is not really an easy point to start cooperation. It's a necessary point, or it's a desirable point from the South Korean side, but it's not at all an easy one. Even if you have very willing and very open partners, like for example the Ministry of Environment is in our case, which is very interested in international cooperations, the border is a very, very sensitive area for them. And that is important to recall, because if you want to designate the DMZ as World Heritage, you need cooperation from the northern side. Functionally, the DMZ is one entity. It makes not a lot of sense to say we only designate the southern side, as it was done with the Biosphere Reserve, where we had these two experiences. First, in 2011, when there was no contact with the north and just the south tried to basically act for both parts of Korea, which didn't work and was rejected. And the second part, where the South Koreans said now, last year, well, we only protect our side and don't really care what the northern part is. But functionally, the DMZ is an entity. To be working properly, there would be two understandings necessary for a designation, namely an understanding with the United Nations Command, and even that seems to be not so easy these days, and also with North Korea. And a one-sided application might work, but the northern side always claims it will actually deepen division. They are not happy for a designation on the southern side, because they will say basically what you do if you protect that area, if you put a watchtower as a cultural heritage or so, basically you want to cement division. We want to overcome it, but you want to cement it. So the question is really, will it prepare for a more peaceful environment if we have only a one-sided application? Ideal would be the joint application, but will that work? And what can the South do to make it work? To discuss that, I want now to look back shortly on the German case of cultural exchanges, especially after the so-called New Ostpolitik, so from the 1970s on. When Germans decided on the basic treaty, East Germany and West Germany, in 1972, one plan was to have also a cultural convention included. But talks to that failed, because East Germany demanded the return of certain cultural goods, mainly in West Berlin, which were in the time of the war brought from the big museums in Berlin to safer parts in the western part of the city, and after 1945 were not returned. And there were also some highly debated cases of artists in both sides. For example, this one artist shown there, Wolf Biermann, who is a songwriter who was invited into the West, who was a, well, critical songwriter, but first of all accepted in East Germany, and he was invited by the West German trade unions, but when he came to West Germany, East Germany simply said, you are not allowed to return to our country. That was all cases, that was in 1976, all cases which made it so difficult even in Germany to have cultural exchanges. The demand was very strong for, especially for West German culture in the East, for example, for pop music and rock music. And actually, it was so strong that East Germans regularly translated, especially English songs, into German and played them with their own bands. And they had to actually put a quota on that, so that only 40% of music could originate from the West. There you see already the big difference of the Korean case and the German case, because it would be impossible to think that there would be South Korean songs played in North Korean television, or even the other way around. So it took Germans from the basic treaty another 14, 15 years, and in renewed negotiations in the 1980s, until a cultural convention could be jointly decided. And that was done in 1968 finally. In that time, East Germany already had reevaluated their older art and history, became more comfortable with it. It was called the so-called Prussian Renaissance, where old monuments were again put into the streets, like the monument of Frederick the Great you see there in Berlin. And then when the cultural convention was concluded, there was a list of 100 projects, including university partnerships and exchanges, which were priority projects and which were slowly implemented, though as you can see from 1986 it was only 3 more years actually until the end of East Germany. So there was a strong increase of cultural cooperation afterwards, but it was in the ending years of East Germany already. And though it was not frequent, but it was increasingly normal. That's a book I have actually. It's called Writers from East Germany. Can you imagine a book in South Korea, Writers from North Korea? You can do it with this. There was this one book of a kind of underground writing, but regularly to publish North Korean publications here would not be very easy. You talk about cultural cooperation, you talk about having a joint, maybe a World Heritage designation, but you don't really cooperate. So maybe it would be good to start with a much broader idea of cooperating broadly in culture, and then come to a joint understanding also. What do the other understand by designating something like the DMZ? I also want very shortly, time allowing, to look at the international cultural policy of East Germany, because that's interesting. On the one hand, East Germany started very early to work for and later in international organizations. In 1955, they built a national commission for UNESCO. In that time, they could not even enter UNESCO or the UN system, because due to the conflicts, both Germans were basically, until 1972, barred from entering the United Nations. Only afterwards they did. But the East Germans saw international organizations mainly as a forum for forwarding their own propaganda or their own ideological view, but not really were interested in cooperating deeply with them in terms of finances, maybe understandable, personnel, concept. So their main interest was really to use the international meetings of these conventions to give speeches and to talk, as one East German said, spreading the truth about socialist order of society and for the class struggle with peaceful means, but not really as a field where you could deeply work in. And the cultural heritage of East Germany, which after unification often became listed as World Heritage, actually decayed. You see here some example for that, like the streets of Görlitz, which are now World Heritage, and actually the East Germans, because they were not able to sustain these old cities, they were planning to completely erase it and rebuild a modern city. So that means East Germany did not really work on cultural heritage until the very end of its existence. Only in 1989, just a year before they stopped to exist, they had their first application for cultural heritage, and actually one project later became of these also World Heritage. That's the Potsdam Gardens and Palaces. Now, I also want shortly to look at natural heritage in the border area. In the West Germany, we had this drive for natural parks since the 1950s. And some of them were also cross-border, and it was again a functional question, because it was a question which areas belong ecologically together, like the Schalsee area, which is today a UNESCO biosphere reserves in the northern part of Germany. But there was no debate between East and West Germany on the inner German border. What we are not very proud of, what we call the Green Belt, that is this system of nature protected areas along the former inner German border. It was a development which almost entirely took place after unification. And only in the 1980s there was some form of consciousness in West Germany that this area was something to be protected and to be cherished. And in East Germany there was no willingness to discuss it. I will have unfortunately not time enough to discuss it with you, but you see here the former so-called death strip, who became, after the unification, what we call the Green Belt system now, which had very important value and became actually the largest biotope association in Europe, with more than 1,300 kilometer length, with important species in terms of the fauna. And now my last comments. I think, based on what we saw in the German case, you should work on World Cultural Heritage designation, but not start with it. You should start with a much broader idea of cooperation of North and South Korea in cultural matters, and from that come to a joint understanding how to come maybe in the future to a joint designation. Sorry for being 20 minutes too long. Thank you very much.
네, 젤리거 박사님 발표
Thank you, Mr. Zelliger, for your presentation.
평화 기반
North and South Korea is based upon a fragile peace regime while they are pursuing a joint designation. So cooperation between West and East Germany was dealt with in his presentation. Even though it is not included in his presentation, as you can see from his paper, instead of trying to strike a grand bargain, it is important to enter into a smaller agreement in order to make real progress. I think that is what is required against the current environment. I think we will go into details about that during the discussion session. Thank you.
Okay, next. Our next speaker is Mr. Hyun-gyun No, Cultural Heritage Team Manager of the Gyeonggi Institute of Cultural Properties. Mr. No, please go ahead. The speaker is not using the microphone. Yes, today my presentation topic is on DMZ's value as a World Heritage Site and the role of Gyeonggi Province. Well, DMZ and a World Heritage both are very difficult topic, and today I'm also touching upon the role of Gyeonggi province. So it is not an easy presentation to do, but do I have a pointer? But I will try to do my best in explaining about these topics. First, I would like to explain why the Korean DMZ should be designated as a World Heritage Site and explain about the DMZ's value as a World Heritage Site. And I am also participating in the survey group for the DMZ's value as a World Heritage Site, and DMZ's value can be categorized into different categories, and I think in a later occasion I will be able to give a more detailed presentation on DMZ's value. And I will finish off by briefing you on some of the roles that Gyeonggi provincial government can play in this journey. Well, World Heritage Site is very popular. I think many people are saying that World Heritage Site designation is the most popular institution of UNESCO. And last year, when Korea's Seowon, or the Confucian Academies of Korea, was designated as a World Heritage Site, I also participated in the General Assembly. And I think inscription of a World Heritage Site is one of the most effective ways to promote our cultural heritage. And here we created these kinds of leaflets to explain about the DMZ, what kind of place this is, and how this place can be designated as a World Heritage Site. So last year, we did some initial works preparing for the inscription of DMZ as a World Heritage Site, and we had several interviews and meetings with the relevant people at UNESCO. And they were saying that DMZ is an area that has many values. It has a very pristine natural environment because of its inaccessibility and also many other kinds of values. But they said that it is a place of great significance because it symbolizes peace on the Korean peninsula. And most of all, they stress that this value is the most important, and that is why North and South Korea should join hands together in getting the DMZ inscribed on the World Heritage Site. Actually, President Moon Jae-in of the Republic of Korea also made his address at the United Nations General Assembly and proposed transforming DMZ into an international peace zone. Also, UNESCO Director General Audrey Azoulay also mentioned that inscribing the DMZ as a World Heritage Site jointly with North Korea would actually be in line with UNESCO's spirit of achieving peace. So if you go to the DMZ area, you can see that there is the Panmungeok and the House of Freedom, and in between there is UNESCO's facility, and that should become a symbol of peace, she said. So I have done some research on DMZ and found that this is data that is based on 10 years ago. There are lots of tourism projects going on in this area, and also nowadays many tourism projects are being announced. These tourism projects, I think, can help DMZ's designation as a World Heritage Site, or it can also become an obstacle. So let's take a look at what kind of value DMZ has as a World Heritage. In order to become a World Heritage, you need to meet certain requirements of the World Heritage Center, and we need to really know the language they are using. UNESCO is providing oversight over all these process, and there is World Heritage Center, and the ultimate decision will be made by the World Heritage Committee. And in each field, the World Heritage Committee will be working with advisory bodies such as IUCN, ICOMOS, and ICROM. So there are these three advisory bodies working together with UNESCO. So to briefly explain, these are government-like agencies, and ICORM will be providing training and education to the people. And we have natural properties and cultural properties. And for the screening of cultural properties, the advice will come from ECOMAS, and for a natural heritage, IUCN will be serving as the advisory board. And these organizations will be conducting the screening and also doling out recommendations to UNESCO and the World Heritage Committee so that they can make their decisions based on these data. And there is this selection criteria that is called the outstanding universal value. We need to meet this standard in order to get the DMZ inscribed on the list. So however we believe that DMZ has a value, if it doesn't meet this requirement, it cannot be inscribed on the World Heritage Site. If our ultimate goal is to get the DMZ inscribed on the list, then we need to meet these criteria. There are 10 criteria based on outstanding universal value, and up until criteria 6, it's for cultural heritage, and from criteria 7 to 10, it applies to natural heritage. And the screening entities are different. For cultural heritage, it is ECOMAS, and for natural heritage, it is IUCN. So if we look at the DMZ, we could probably consider first inscribing the southern part as a World Heritage Site, and then pursue the inscription of the northern part of the DMZ, working together with North Korea. However, most ideally, it would be better to get the DMZ jointly inscribed on the World Heritage Site. If we are inscribing DMZ on our own, it would be inscribed as a single property, and it can also be inscribed as a serial property. But if North Korea and South Korea are joining hands, it would become a transboundary property. Transboundary properties are the properties that are sitting on the borderline, and there are also transnational serial properties. And if the DMZ will be inscribed on the World Heritage List together with North Korea, I think it would be best to get that inscribed as a transnational serial property. Other than this outstanding universal value selection criteria, there are certain standards that we need to meet, and these are the 3 pillars. First, we need to meet the requirement of integrity and authenticity. And the other part that is becoming more and more important these days is the protection and management system, whether the property is properly protected and managed. So once the property is designated as a World Heritage Site, then the property owner should be able to provide an institutional framework or an agency that will be responsible for the protection and management of that property. Well, due to the COVID-19 pandemic, the General Assembly of the World Heritage Committee was postponed. So as of today, there are 1,121 properties, and out of that, there are 869 cultural properties and 213 natural properties and 39 mixed properties. And out of that, 39 properties are transboundary properties. So we keep exploring the values of the DMZ. A lot of studies have been conducted on the topic of DMZ for a very long time. We have seen these publications. However, as we were working on this agenda of World Heritage inscription, we discovered that there were certain limitations to the research on the DMZ because of military installations in the DMZ proper area. And most of the research was conducted on the border area instead of the DMZ proper, which is between the northern limit line and the southern limit line. There were a few studies conducted on the DMZ proper. However, those studies were not aimed at getting the DMZ inscribed on the World Heritage List, so that is why we have some limitations of research. But fortunately, last year, the Cultural Administration of Korea, Gyeonggi Provincial Government, and Gangwon Provincial Government signed an MOU to work together for the joint inscription of the DMZ on the UNESCO World Heritage List in July last year. And we also had a kick-off ceremony for the DMZ field inspection team this year. So we are currently conducting inspection on the DMZ. But DMZ is a dangerous area. It is full of landmines, and recently their tension escalated because of the explosion of the Joint Liaison Office. And because of all these reasons, investigation and inspection were quite difficult. And due to the recent flooding, many landmines were leaked out. And that is why we are experiencing many difficulties in inspection. However, still inspection is underway. So from Paju to Goseong, we have this DMZ and we have natural heritage elements and cultural heritage elements and also some value elements as a legacy of the war. So in these three categories, we are conducting research, and these investigations are led by the Cultural Heritage Administration. So once the inspection is over, official announcement will be made by the Cultural Heritage Foundation. So that is the end of my update about the DMZ's value, and let me now move on to the role of Gyeonggi Provincial Government. Of course, the inscription project is led by the central government. Under the leadership of the Cultural Heritage Administration, we are conducting investigation and we are in the first step of the process. Well, the DMZ area spans across Gyeonggi Province and Gangwon Province together. So I looked at previous cases where provincial governments joined hands together to provide a systematic protection and management system for other heritages. So for example, for the inscription of Namhan Mountain Fortress on the World Heritage List, many local governments worked together to get this cultural heritage inscribed. And also for the Baekje historic area, there was a separate agency launched to prepare for the inscription of the property on the World Heritage Site. So what about the DMZ? Do we have a separate agency that is in charge of preparing for the inscription? Many different divisions within the Gyeonggi Provincial Government and Gangwon Provincial Government are responsible for this work. So we need an integrated body that can really lead the process, but still we lack this agency or organization that would lead this effort. So I believe that if we were to set this organization up, then probably it would be established by the Cultural Heritage Administration because it is a central government agency. And of course, the Gyeonggi Provincial Government would work together with the Cultural Heritage Administration through this dedicated committee or team. And there would be a separate committee on the World Heritage inscription of DMZ, and I believe that Gyeonggi Province should participate in both the team and the committee so that we can facilitate communication between the government and local residents. Recently, there was a good news. To provide legislative support to these efforts, there was a special bill on North-South joint support for inscription of Korea's DMZ on the World Heritage List, and the legislative notice was expired recently on August 2nd. And on this legislative notice, you can post opinions, and in total, 134 opinions were submitted. And here you can see there are opinions about the organization of the dedicated agency. And if you take a look at all 134 opinions submitted to this special bill legislative notice, you can see that all the opinions are actually in objection. People are against this idea. So we looked into all these 134 opinions, and the largest portion was simple opposition. They were just objecting without a reason, and there were other reasons like this. Some people argued that it's waste of taxpayers' money. Some people said it's too premature at this stage, and some people criticized that it is a populist policy, and so on. And there was not a single approval to this special bill. So is it that the purpose of this special bill itself is wrong? I do not believe so. Well, I was quite surprised because the result was quite different from what I felt from my conversation with local residents, because a lot of local residents there, when I had direct conversation with them, they were really welcoming this special bill. So I think this is an issue of promotion, lack of promotion, and lack of communication with local residents. So if these kinds of efforts are led by the central government, I believe that coordinating communication with local residents and local communities will become critical. So in conclusion, the inscription itself should be led by the central government and the experts of the Cultural Heritage Administration, and the provincial governments can serve the role of facilitating communication and conducting field research, and those are the areas where provincial governments like Gyeonggi Province can contribute. And I hope that these efforts are more widely promoted to the public, but due to COVID-19, there are certain challenges. But through different routes and channels, we hope that this national project can be promoted to the local communities near the DMZ in a more effective way. And we hope to communicate the purpose of this effort to the Korean people better, so that it can lead to an ultimate peace on the Korean peninsula. And I believe that Gyeonggi Province has a big role to play. And also cities like Paju and Yeoncheon have important roles to play as well. With that, I would like to conclude my presentation. Thank you. Thank you very much. That was Mr. Tae-hoon Moon. He explained about DMZ's value as a world heritage, and he mentioned that Gyeonggi provincial government should work together with Gangwon provincial governments so that we can meet the selection criteria of UNESCO to get the DMZ inscribed as a World Heritage Site. And he also mentioned about the special bill which was recently submitted, and he also mentioned about some of the objections raised to that special bill. And he also said that actually when he had conversation with local residents, they were actually in approval of this special bill, and he stressed the importance of communication with local communities in that end. Thank you very much for your presentation. Now we would like to jump into discussion. I think we have sufficient time, so I would like to give 13 to 15 minutes to each discussant. First, I would like to invite Mr. Soo-jae Lee from the Korea Environment Institute for his discussion.
Good afternoon. I'm Lee Soo-jae from Korea Environment Institute. So during the DMZ forum, I received some scripts beforehand. So allow me to read my paper to conduct my discussion. For starters, for Mr. Zeliger, thank you for your presentation, including a lot of interesting facts. Thank you for your insightful presentation. If I may summarize your presentation, we need to make ceaseless effort toward reconciliation, which I fully support. You can start with a cultural cooperation before expanding to other areas, to which I fully agree. You cited a lot of German experiences. You also talked about how those experiences can teach a lesson for Korea. I hope such similar efforts can bear fruit in Korea. As the chair said earlier, we need to start with some small but meaningful steps instead of trying to do something big at first time. Regarding your presentation, let me offer my comments. There has been ups and downs between inter-Korean relations. The Korean Peninsula has a long history, so governments of different nature have existed around the Korean Peninsula, and these governments have been in conflict all the time. So looking back on Korea's history, I think such differences can be overcome. I believe our division is very short in the grand big scheme of things. I believe we'll eventually moving toward the goal of unification in the future. When it comes to designating DMZ as a World Heritage regarding who protects what, how, and why, I believe the key is raising awareness about the DMZ and obtaining a designation for the DMZ. Ted Turner, the Senate founder, triggered international interest in DMZ as ecological value, and his presentation was enough to raise awareness both at home and abroad about the importance of DMZ. Also, the presenter talked about Biosphere Reserve, Geopark designation, and World Heritage. So you talked about some successful and field cases and the characteristics of these designations. I think we can take that into account in our effort to pursue a designation. And the presenter said that Geopark designation has the least contribution in terms of tourism area compared with Biosphere Reserve and World Heritage Site, but considering changes in the trend, I believe the contribution made by Geopark designation will increase in the future. And designation has been conducted in a way to boost the living standards of locals. So whatever designation we are pursuing, it is not the designation itself that matters. Whatever the designation should be conducted in a way to boost the living standards of locals. And in your presentation, you talked about Biosphere Reserve and some climate change implication. So climate change can be a threat to animals and plants along the DMZ. DMZ is delineated by wire fence. DMZ is an obstacle to migratory species. If we dismantle the DMZ in a slow pace, that could only hurt the chances of animals and plants. So I'm going to talk about how to address this toward the later part of my presentation. And the presenter talked about the importance of cultural cooperation. The presenter talked about cooperation between the two Koreas in cultural realm. So non-political cooperation, such as cultural cooperation, should be emphasized in order to bring the two Koreas closer together. If you take a look at the recent trend in North Korea is slowly opening up. People in the cultural community should be right to pursue continuous economic cooperation with their northern counterparts. The presenter also talked about German culture exchanges and cooperation along the border between the two Germanys. The presenter talked about the division between West and East Germany, which I found interesting. And we can use international organization and private organizations in order to pursue cooperation which can serve as a buffer between North and South Korea in terms of confrontation. He also talked about Greenbelt. Fortunately, Korea has gone beyond development mentality, and decision makers and stakeholders appreciating the value of nature are increasing in numbers, and the DMZ has maintained the pristine nature of the DMZ. And we are building a decision-making process that can stop development-only mentality. So preserving the DMZ is no longer our ideal. It can be a reality we can achieve soon in the future. So we need to, DMZ is serving a very important function in terms of calling attention to the importance of cooperation to decision makers and others. The presenter also dealt with the way forward. So there's a question of whether it is realistic to obtain such a designation. And this is my view. We have a spirit to face a challenge. Obtaining the DMZ designation can be a daunting task. That doesn't mean we should stop. We have to do everything we can in order to obtain that designation. President Kennedy once dreamt about putting a man on the moon. He was pursuing that not because it was easy to do, but because it was difficult to do. So we have to do everything we can in order to obtain such a designation for the DMZ. So this is the capability we should demonstrate to the international community. In your presentation, you talked about the importance of making small progresses instead of trying to strike a grand bargain. So let me offer some comments in that regard. Biosphere reserve designation and geopark designation have already occurred. So we have to fully tap into that designations. The biosphere reserve is located along the DMZ, so it has potential to expand it to include the northern part of the DMZ. When it comes to the geopark designation, Hantan, Imjin rivers are some of the key parts of the geopark. There is a geopark along the Hantan River. When designating the Hantan River as a geopark, UNESCO recommended joint research between North and South Korea. So we can use that as a means to initiate academic cooperation between North and South Korea. Fortunately, last year, North Korea applied to designate Mount Baekdu as a geopark. Without the COVID-19, a review would have been conducted on the designation on the Jeju Island, but the conference was pushed back to next year. But Jeju is intent on hosting the conference. So hopefully next year we'll be able to review the application on the Jeju Island next year. So why does a geopark matter? Geopark can serve as an opportunity for us to engage in a direct cooperation with the North. A geopark conference is slated to occur on the Jeju Island, and we are intent on knowing whether North Korea will attend the conference. If North Korea does, there will be an opportunity for both Koreas to engage in meaningful dialogue. So we can do some torch relay covering the entire Korea. And we can also promote cooperation among geoparks in North and South Korea. We can also host photo exhibitions in a third-party country showcasing photos from South and North Korea. So there's a network of geoparks in Asia Pacific. A national representative must participate in the network as an advisor. So the network allows North and South Korea to directly talk with each other. So that is why we fully support North Korea's application to obtain the geopark designation. We also plan to do more in preparation for increased cooperation between North and South Korea. We can have an event called Meeting Together, inspired by Colliding Together. So Baltic countries are drifting further apart, away from each other. But instead of Korea getting further away from each other, we should pursue the idea of colliding together, bringing the two Koreas closer together. Of course, there have been the events of collisions, but these collisions can serve as a creative opportunity to promote unity between the two Koreas. DMZ is serving as ecological barrier. So let me talk about some measures to mitigate the nature of DMZ as barriers. DMZ is a physical barrier. We should turn that into a virtual barrier. Aeronautics, digital, thermal sensing technology, AI, offer various tracing and tracking capabilities. The barbed wire on the DMZ is intended to deter movement. So we should turn that physical wire fence into a digital wire fence. So they can allow animals to move freely while controlling the movement of people. So we can select some areas as a pilot projects before expanding the area to the entire DMZ area. When it comes to the possibility of designation, I believe DMZ has a good chance of winning the designation as a World Heritage Site. In time, we can tap into UNESCO's upstream process in order to gauge the chance of DMZ obtaining that designation.
Next, I would like to thank Mr. No Hyun-gyun for his wonderful presentation. Well, he mentioned that DMZ should be recognized for its value as a World Heritage Site.
Oh, sorry. 그다음 한반도 DMZ 세계유산 등재 가치에 대해서
Next,
세계유산의 등재 기준에 대해서 말씀해
he also explained about the World Heritage Site selection criteria, and he emphasized the protection and management system of the World Heritage Site. So Gyeonggi Provincial Government and Gangwon Provincial Government should work to train experts that can work on this project. And also, currently, there is an inspection on the entire DMZ area, and if we have sufficient database created based on that inspection, we would be able to come up with the most optimal strategy to get the DMZ inscribed on the World Heritage Site. And he also explained about the importance of having a dedicated organization for the preparation of the inscription of DMZ as a World Heritage Site, and I hope that we can prepare that dedicated organization. Next, he also mentioned about the special bill on North-South joint support for the inscription of DMZ on the World Heritage List, and I believe that this is a very important bill, and regardless of the change in government, this should continue to go on. Mr. No also mentioned about 134 objections to the special bill, and this means that some of the local residents objected this idea, but I do not think this is something that we should be disappointed about, because I think what is more important is to enhance their understanding about the value of DMZs. And about the conclusion, of course, I think DMZ cannot be free from development pressure. So that is why we need to carry out continuous investigation so that we can select the right targets. And also we need to prepare the institutional frameworks such as international laws and domestic laws. And he also mentioned about serial properties. And as we can get the DMZ designated as a serial property on World Heritage Site list. So I think we should take a phased approach in selecting some of the elements that can be inscribed first. And because UNESCO has this interesting process called the upstream process, probably we could get some advice on how to participate in this process and carry out follow-up measures. I hope that our descendants could praise us for our efforts, and I would like to wish the DMZ Forum for its prosperous and successful holding. Well, thank you very much, Mr. Lee Soo-jae, for your discussion. He made a lot of proposals and suggestions, and he mentioned about the GEO conference that will be held next year in Jeju Island. And he mentioned about the deliberation that would go on the Baekdu Mountain, and he mentioned that that could serve as a good opportunity to actually increase cooperation and exchange between North and South Korea. Also, for the geopark in the Asia-Pacific region, he mentioned about how there can be an Asia-Pacific geopark network, and through this network, Asian countries can enhance their cooperation with each other, and of course, North and South Korea can also enhance cooperation. And he also mentioned about transforming physical facilities in the DMZ into a digital facility. And he also made remarks about Mr. No's presentation, and regarding his presentation, he said that the provincial government should focus on training experts and professionals, and once the DMZ inspection result or outcome comes out, we could probably come up with a better strategy based on the data that we derive from our field investigation. And he also stressed the importance of communicating with local residents. Now we would like to move on to our next discussant, who is Ms. Eunjin Park, Director at the National Institute of Ecology.
Thank you. We have some online participants, and I can see some familiar faces who are joining us online. Nice to meet you. Today we heard two excellent presentations. I really enjoyed their presentations. First, Dr. Zeliger gave a presentation. On his presentation, I almost fully agree with him. So his presentation was excellent, and his presentation spoke about the thoughts I have had on my mind. First, when it comes to spatial segregation, we need to take a stepwise approach. So we need to think about local government, local development, and sustainable development. We also need to think about activities that can happen in the civilian control zone. We can also think about areas of the DMZ where there's a need for inter-Korean cooperation. So I have always emphasized such a two-track approach. So in that sense, I believe his presentation sits well with my opinion. As a first step, we need to take a civilian control zone. In order to promote cooperation along the DMZ, we have to form a basis in the form of civilian control zone where we can take action right away, where we can seek understanding from the local community. And we can also build on that project to lay the groundwork for inter-Korean cooperation. So that will be our first step in our dual track approach. And second, we need to broaden cooperation with the North. Dr. Zeliger talked about cultural exchanges and exchanges in soft power area in that context. So there can be opportunity for us to cooperate with the North on North Korea's environmental issues. And after that, we can tackle political and military issues, after which we can bring peace and include the DMZ in the reconciliation effort. So I have always emphasized this three-step approach. And Mr. Zeliger talked about a biosphere reserve and some experiences that were not successful. He also talked about implications of such failed cases, to which I fully agree. Biosphere reserve designation was achieved along the Yeongcheon-Imjin River and in Gangwon Ecological Park last year. So we obtained these two successful applications for designation as biosphere reserve. But before that, we had tried to obtain the designation for the past 20 years. And there has been a lot of changes in terms of concept over the previous 20 years. In 2001, when Kim Dae-jung took office, there was an effort to designate DMZ as a biosphere reserve along the DMZ. Back then, DMZ served as the starting point. DMZ served as a starting point for immediate cooperation between the two Koreas. The concept of biosphere reserve is not just about protection and conservation. Rather, the designation can serve as an area for cooperation, an area where cooperation can be promoted to achieve a development in the local community. But that concept was missing from the first designation effort back in 2001. And North Korea has a completely different idea about the DMZ than South Korea. Still, the South Korean government pushed ahead with its own idea of DMZ designation. So there has been no effort to understand the importance of such a designation. But in 2011, actually, I was involved in writing the application along with the Minister of Environment. That experience presented a turning point in our efforts. So we wanted to include the DMZ for a designation. So we decided to only include the southern part of the DMZ for the designation. Paju and Yeoncheon and 5 other counties, including Yeoncheon, were included in the application. So let me share with you some backstory. So it is right to exclude militarily sensitive areas in the designation. So I have emphasized that myself, but back then, due to circumstances and due to interest from different ministries and local communities, the belief was that if the DMZ is missing from the designation does not mean much. At that time, we toured 7 counties to provide hearings and hold town hall meetings, and Cheonan County was severely opposing the idea because the DMZ dealt with military sensitive areas. So instead, we chose to include 2 counties in Gyeonggi Province and 4 counties in Gangwon Province for a designation. But still, the idea was opposed based on the grounds that DMZ should be included in the designation, and there should be no division even among South Koreans in terms of designation. And back then, we had no idea what was the ultimate purpose of such an effort. And Cheon's part of the DMZ was not included in the application. When our application was under review, of course, our application was severely opposed by the North. So areas for cooperation and buffer zones were not included in the designation in the Cheonan County, and our application was not accepted because of the need to include other areas in our designation. I'm sharing with you this backstory because that is in line with Dr. Zeliger's presentation, and few people know well about this backstory. DMZ is a sensitive area in terms of military and politics. When we cannot gain understanding from the North, we shouldn't be preoccupied with the idea of winning designation for a DMZ. So the way forward should be building consensus with the local communities. And we need to focus on what we can do right now and what can be done later. So we have to seek such temporal and spatial segregation in our approach. As mentioned by the speaker, it is not a good idea to immediately start the effort to designate DMZ as a World Heritage Site. To that, I fully agree. And that said, we need to reinforce the protection mechanism of the DMZ. We have to be prepared for the task that can be done immediately. And at the same time, we need to think about ways of bringing about changes in North Korea and eliciting cooperation from the North. As the speaker said in the presentation, blowing up a guard post, followed by the explosion of Inter-Korean Liaison Office, shows the volatile situation along the DMZ. And inter-Korean relations reached a deadlock almost overnight. So against this backdrop, how can you find a way of seeking cooperation with the North? So currently, we are at a loss on identifying ways of cooperating with the North. So we can use multilateral framework to elicit a cooperation. And as other discussants said earlier, we can use a Geopark Convention as a way to elicit a cooperation from the North. So we need to identify such many venues and other venues that can draw indirect cooperation from the North.
회장님 발표하신 내용 중에서 여러 가지 좋은 말씀들 많이 해주셨고 전체적으로 필요한 그 프로세스들 얘기를 해주셨는데요. 결과적으로는 그 경기도에서 특히 지역사회의 역할이 굉장히 중요한데 앞에서도 이미 이제 경기도 같은 경우는 연천에 임진강 생물권 보전 지역을 지정을 했단 말이죠. 그러면 지정하고 나서는 뭘 했느냐? 저는 묻고 싶어요. 뭘 하고 있는지 잘 모르겠습니다. 그래서 지정만 한다고 끝나는 게 아니거든요. 분명히 지정하고 나서 그 개념에 맞는 내용들이 성공적인 모델을 만들어야 될 필요가 있는데 지금 과연 그렇게 하고 있는가? 이거를 좀
into a very successful model. So not only the designation is important, but after the designation, we need to create a successful model. And if we want to get the DMZ inscribed as a World Heritage Site, we need to meet the authenticity criteria, integrity criteria, and the protection and management system criteria. And creating a protection and management system does not happen in one day. In order to create this protection and management system, we need to provide training and education to the local communities so that their perception can change and their awareness level can be raised. And especially Gyeonggi provincial government is not doing a good job in this area. If we take a look at the data from Gyeonggi province to Charwon, the ground is very flat, and that is why we have a lot of development projects going on. And starting from the east side in the Gangwon provincial government's territory, it's actually a mountainous area. If we take a look at the civilian control zone, 90% of the area is a mountainous area in Gangwon area. And we also have some biosphere reserves and some natural conservation areas there in Gangwon province. So Gangwon province is a province which has an area where it is relatively easy to get the World Heritage Site designation because, of course, many parts of Gangwon Province is already designated as a nature conservation zone. But what about the Gyeonggi provincial area? 40% is agricultural land and wetlands and so on, and 50% is the mountainous area. So that is why there is a lot of development pressure here in this area, and there is conflict within the local communities there in Gyeonggi Province. And the size of the natural conservation area in this area is only about 20 square kilometers. And on the flat area, there is no natural conservation zone in Gyeonggi Province. So in this situation, how can we create a protection and management system for these areas? I think this is one of the most important considerations that we should give. What about the wetlands and the farmlands in this flat area? These areas are very rich in biodiversity, but at the same time, it is exposed to many development pressure. So in this situation, what should we do? The direction that we should take is an important consideration that requires our determination, and we need to also forge consensus with many stakeholders, including the local community. We need to lay the foundation for the local community and local residents to accept the proposal that we make. And how should we approach this issue? Should we just strengthen regulation to strengthen protection? Already the area is militarily protected, so in this situation, is it right to really increase regulation for the purpose of protection? In that case, that could also lead to rejection and opposition. So to get the DMZ inscribed on the World Heritage Site, we need to think about what kind of incentives we can give to local residents to change their attitudes. And what about cooperation with North Korea? How can we induce cooperation from North Korea? When the relation is strained and when the relation is better, I think depending on the situation, we need to come up with different methods or strategies for cooperation with North Korea. So devising these strategies and tactics, we need to give a more detailed thoughts on it. We need to have more in-depth discussion on this topic. So that would be the end of my discussion. Thank you. Thank you very much, Ms. Eunjin Park. She made some important proposals. She said that there are things that South Korea can do alone, and there are things that we should do jointly with North Korea. And she mentioned that it is important that we should start working on those that can be implemented right away. And regarding Mr. No's presentation, she said that in the area where there is a lot of development pressure, we need to think about how to boost the protection and management system of these areas. And she shared her concern about that. And she also mentioned that we need to prepare for different scenarios on our relation with North Korea in the case that our relation with North Korea is strained, and when the situation is better, we need to have a strategic approach depending on the different scenarios. Thank you very much, Mr. Lee and Ms. Park. I thought that we will have enough time after the discussion, but I think we are quite tight on schedule. So I would like to give 1 minute each to our presenters to give feedback to these discussions. Please, Mr. Zeliger.
Well, Dr. Lee and Dr. Park, thank you very much for your very interesting comments. And I wrote 3 pages from this. I really learned a lot there again. And we didn't have a big disagreement here, I think, and I was very pleased actually, because it has not always been like that we agree we need small steps, we need to do steps which are doable now and not in the future for a big idea or so. And I read this morning that even the new Minister of Unification actually stressed this small-scale project, and I think Now the question is, can we do it if the North Koreans simply refuse? But as you already mentioned there, I think it can be done still in quite more venues and more events than we think. And I want just to mention 4 here, which are directly related. One has been mentioned already. One is the IUCN. We have 2 North Korean bodies, the Ministry of Environment and the National Committee for Nature Conservation, which are members of IUCN. In IUCN meetings, it's a wonderful way to meet each other, do trainings together maybe on the regional level or so with other states, which make it more acceptable for the northern side. So it's a very good way to go forward. The same with the geopark network. We can think of trainings for geopark managers where North and South Koreans meet and then can also discuss their joint concerns. There's a flyway partnership, East Asian, Australasian flyway partnership, a mixture of governments, including North Korea since 2018, and NGOs. Another venue which is very meaningful here because we have especially these highly symbolic cranes, which are a bird which is wonderful for raising the image of the DMZ and also where the North Koreans have a great interest themselves in. Or at the western side, on the seaside, we have this so-called YSLME, the Yellow Sea Large Marine Ecosystem project, which is a project now for ROC, for South Korea and China, but which could also include and try to include North Korea. So we can make these opportunities to meet. From there we can come to a joint understanding and then maybe to the big goal, which would be the designation. And we also, as a partner involved with North Korea, are very willing to cooperate with your organizations respectively to make these things happen. Thank you.
네, 젤리그 박사님 감사합니다.
Thank you, Mr. Zelliger. Now we would like to move on to Mr. Lee Soo-jae. Oh, sorry, it's Mr. No. Thank you very much for the discussions. Well, to share my thoughts on the content of the discussion, I also believe that cooperation with North Korea is very important. So actually last year, we tried to communicate with the North Korean side, and we also sent out letters to the North Korean side, but as if we are the only one in love, well, we didn't receive any reply from the North Korean side. So I think there is a gap in how we perceive DMZ between North and South Korea. But I believe that if certain conditions are met, North Korea would also be willing to participate in these efforts for joint inscription. According to a research, the DMZ area between the Southern Lemon Line and the Northern Lemon Line, there were many towns there in the DMZ area. Of course, many towns were located in the Gyeonggi province area, and because there were towns there were lots of houses and buildings with owners. However, now people cannot claim ownership of those real estate. However, once the DMZ area becomes accessible, then the development pressure will grow. Then, in that case, will the DMZ area in its original form will stay intact like this? Well, cultural heritage and natural heritage are different. If that is a cultural heritage, we become the manager of that cultural heritage property, and our responsibility will become protecting that cultural heritage so that we can hand it over to our descendants. So if we get the DMZ inscribed on the World Heritage Site list, then it means that our protection system will become stronger. And there are certain principles that we need to follow, and we need to develop this area, if we were to develop this area, to the extent that we stay within that boundary. So if we do not like to see the DMZ area being destroyed by development, I think we should all make efforts together so that we can achieve our ultimate goal of DMZ's inscription as a World Heritage. It doesn't require just a few divisions' efforts. All local governments, such as Gyeonggi Provincial Government and basic local governments, also the county government, should also join hands. With that, I would like to finish my remark. Yes, Mr. No, thank you very much. I think we are a little bit late behind the schedule, but I would like to use just 1 minute as a concluding remark. I think there were 3 meaningful points that were raised during this session. First of all, World Heritage Site, Biosphere, or Geopark designations themselves are very important. These themselves are important. However, protection should be given the focus. So we should focus on protecting these areas, and once the protection is done properly, we should really consider the designation of these sites. So the priority should be different. That is one point I would like to make. And secondly, the communication between stakeholders and conflict management between stakeholders is very important, and that was a very important insight that we learned through this session. And third, last but not least, there should be a public consensus on the designation of DMZ as a World Heritage Site. Well, we hope to have more detailed conversations about this important topic, but due to time constraints, we would like to conclude this session here. I once again thank the 2 presenters and 2 discussants. With that, please, this ends the session. Well, that ends session number 2.1, DMZ as a World Heritage. South and North Korea are both working to overcome the COVID-19 pandemic, and I hope that the 2 Koreas could use this as an opportunity to further improve our relations. I would like to thank all the participants for gracing this event with your presence. With this, we would like to conclude DMZ Forum 2020. Thank you.